What was it like on the set of Little House on the Prairie? The actress who played Michael Landon's wife says it wasn't as wholesome as it seemed.
This scene wasn't edited. Look again at the Little House on the Prairie blooper. You've watched Laura Ingalls run through that famous field 100 times. You've seen Pa strum his fiddle by the fire and believed, just for a moment, that life on the prairie really was that simple and that sweet. But what if I told you that almost every warm, wholesome moment on that set had a much messier story happening just off camera? A show about honesty, family, and simple living was hiding real feuds, real heartbreak, real secrets, and enough continuity errors to make even the most devoted fan do a double take. Stick around, because by the end of this video you'll never watch Little House on the Prairie the same way again. Let's start with the relationship almost nobody expected. On screen, Laura Ingalls and Nellie Oleson were bitter enemies. Nellie was the spoiled town brat who tormented sweet, hard-working Laura at every opportunity, and audiences ate it up. But behind the scenes, Melissa Gilbert, who played Laura, and Alison Arngrim, who played Nellie, were genuinely close friends. They spent their off hours together, had sleepovers, and pulled pranks on the rest of the cast as a team. The two young actresses were so convincing as rivals that generations of viewers assumed they must have hated each other in real life. In truth, it was the opposite, and their friendship lasted long after the cameras stopped rolling. That same layer of behind-the-scenes friendship extended to Nellie's on-screen husband, Percival, played by actor Steve Tracy. In the show, Nellie and Percival's relationship was written as a dramatic, passionate romance, and the two actors leaned into it hard, often stretching out their affectionate scenes far longer than necessary. Part of the reason was mischief. Steve Tracy and Alison Arngrim were close friends off camera, and they enjoyed using their on-screen romance to fluster their fellow cast member, Melissa Gilbert, who was still a teenager working through her own awkward feelings about screen romance. What made it especially interesting is that Steve Tracy was gay in real life, so the sizzling on-screen chemistry with Nellie was purely performance, a testament to how skilled these actors were at their craft. Speaking of Melissa Gilbert and screen romance, her real discomfort deserves its own mention. She was only 15 years old when she had to film her first on-screen kiss, playing opposite Dean Butler, who portrayed her love interest Almanzo and was in his early 20s at the time. That age gap made the scene genuinely uncomfortable for her, since it was also her first kiss in real life. She turned to Michael Landon, who wasn't just her co-star but also a director on the series and something of a father figure to her. Landon took her concerns to the producers, and they agreed to soften the moment, swapping the kiss for a gentler peck on the cheek. It's a small adjustment, but it says a lot about how the production handled a young actress navigating uncomfortable material in front of a camera. Not every relationship on set was warm, though. While Melissa Gilbert and Alison Arngrim were close, Gilbert did not get along with Melissa Sue Anderson, who played her older sister Mary. On screen, the two sisters shared tender, supportive scenes. Off-screen, they reportedly could not stand one another, and whatever caused the rift never fully healed, even decades after the show ended. Gilbert has spoken about the friction in her memoir, describing her castmate as cold and difficult to work with, though Anderson has never publicly given her side of the story, so the full picture remains one-sided. Other people involved with the production have hinted that Anderson kept to herself and wasn't especially warm toward the rest of the cast, something some attribute to a sheltered upbringing and a protective mother who limited her time socializing on set. Now here's a detail that might genuinely surprise you. Michael Landon, the man who played the devoutly Christian patriarch Charles Ingalls and who often delivered gentle, faith-tinged lessons in the show's closing minutes, was actually Jewish in real life. Born Eugene Maurice Orowitz, Landon took his stage name early in his career. His father was Jewish and his mother was a practicing Catholic, and Landon later said he identified culturally with his father's Jewish heritage even though he didn't strictly practice any organized religion. He believed in God in a broad sense but never felt a conflict between his personal identity and the character he played every week, a character who represented a very specific, idealized image of American Christian family life. While we're talking appearances, let's address that unmistakable head of curly hair. Michael Landon's rich, dark curls became one of his most recognizable features, but that color wasn't natural. His real hair was a much duller ash brown, and he dyed it regularly to maintain the look audiences knew him for. He took the process seriously enough to use a professional stylist, but there was a persistent problem. As his hair started to gray underneath the dye, the combination of studio lighting and natural sunlight sometimes gave his hair a strange purplish tint on camera. The production had to bring in specialized colorists just to keep his signature look consistent from episode to episode. Here's a heavier one. Drinking was reportedly a significant part of daily life on the Little House set. According to accounts from cast members, including Melissa Gilbert's own recollections, alcohol was common among crew members, with especially demanding shooting days sometimes jokingly referred to by the amount of beer consumed to get through them. Gilbert has said that Michael Landon struggled with alcohol during this period of his life, often starting his mornings with coffee that had been quietly spiked and continuing to drink steadily as the day went on. For a long time, most people on set had no real sense of how much he was drinking, because he was careful to keep it hidden. Eventually, though, the pattern became harder to ignore, and it paints a more complicated picture of a man who, on screen, embodied steady, wholesome fatherhood. That relationship between Landon and Gilbert is worth slowing down on, because it's one of the most emotionally layered parts of the show's history. Gilbert lost her adoptive father when she was only 11 years old, and around the same time she was cast as Laura Ingalls. She has said that Michael Landon became something like a real father figure to her during those years, and the two grew extremely close, joking around and looking out for each other well beyond what their working relationship required. But that closeness was tested when Landon left his wife for a makeup artist who worked on the show, Cindy Clerico. Gilbert, who had already experienced her own parents' divorce as a child, felt betrayed by his decision and cut off contact with him for a period of time. It wasn't until Landon was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer that the two reconciled. After his death, Gilbert named one of her own children after him, a quiet tribute to how much that relationship had meant to her, complicated history and all. Michael Landon's death is its own chapter in the show's legacy. Before Little House, he had already built a substantial career, spending 14 years as a lead on the Western series Bonanza alongside actors like Lorne Greene and Dan Blocker. When producer Ed Friendly brought him onto Little House on the Prairie, Landon didn't just star as Charles Ingalls, he also directed a huge portion of the series, ultimately helming 90 of the show's 204 episodes, and he wrote the story for both the original pilot and the series finale. He stepped back from acting for the final season, letting the story shift toward Melissa Gilbert's now-adult, married Laura, while he focused on production. Sadly, Landon passed away from pancreatic cancer at the age of 54. Cast members have described him as warm, charismatic, and endlessly fond of practical jokes, a reputation that shows up again and again in behind-the-scenes stories from the set. And those pranks were apparently constant. Landon had a well-earned reputation as one of the biggest jokesters on set. In one story, he taught Melissa Gilbert and Alison Arngrim how to wrap plastic film over a toilet seat as a prank on unsuspecting crew members. In another, recalled years later by Rachel Greenbush, who played the youngest Ingalls' daughter Carrie, Landon would catch frogs from a nearby creek with the young actresses during breaks, then playfully hide the frogs in his mouth before startling castmates by letting the frog leap out in front of them. It's a strange, funny image, a grown man on a serious historical drama sneaking around with a live frog in his cheek to scare his co-workers, but it captures the lighter side of a production that also dealt with heavy material week to week. And it really did deal with heavy material. Despite its gentle, nostalgic reputation, Little House on the Prairie tackled subjects that were considered bold for network television at the time, including sexual assault, addiction, racism, adoption, and disability. Very few family dramas of that era were willing to touch those topics directly, and in that sense, the show was quietly ahead of its time, using its wholesome setting as a way to sneak difficult conversations into American living rooms. Family ties on the show extended into real life in ways audiences didn't always realize. Jonathan Gilbert, who played Nellie's younger brother Willie Olson, was Melissa Gilbert's real-life adopted brother. Off-screen, the two grew up together, but according to Melissa's own accounts, they eventually became estranged as adults. Jonathan moved away from acting entirely and built a career as a stockbroker in New York after earning his MBA in finance. Melissa, meanwhile, stayed in the entertainment industry, later serving as president of the Screen Actors Guild in the early 2000s and even running for a congressional seat in Michigan in 2016, a campaign she was ultimately forced to step back from due to injuries from an earlier accident. If you've ever wondered whether Walnut Grove was a real place, it is, sort of. Laura Ingalls Wilder, who wrote the original book series the show was based on, genuinely lived near Walnut Grove, Minnesota, as a child, and much of her writing drew from real memories of homesteading life. Walnut Grove itself was founded in the 1870s and remains a small town in Redwood County, Minnesota, to this day. The broader homesteading movement the books were built around encouraged families to move west and build self-sufficient lives from almost nothing, a lifestyle the government romanticized to encourage settlement, but one that was, in reality, grueling and unpredictable for the families who lived it. The show itself came from a fairly simple chain of events. Wilder's books became enormously popular across the country, and that popularity eventually caught the attention of producer Ed Friendly, who acquired the rights and moved quickly to bring the story to television. Little House on the Prairie premiered in September of 1974 and ran for 8 seasons before wrapping up in 1982, followed by a spin-off continuation that shifted focus toward the next generation of characters. Across its run, the show became a genuine staple of American family television, largely thanks to a cast that audiences grew to love as though they were part of their own families. Now let's get into the bloopers, because once you start looking, they're everywhere. One of the most talked about is Laura's pregnancy timeline. According to Melissa Gilbert herself, Laura's on-screen pregnancy stretched on for far longer than biologically possible, announced in one season and somehow still ongoing more than a year later according to the show's own internal timeline. It's the kind of inconsistency that only becomes obvious once someone points it out, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. Then there's the strange appearance of Colonel Sanders in a Season 8 episode called Wave of the Future. In the storyline, a character's restaurant is turned into a franchise, and Colonel Sanders shows up to offer a competing chicken franchise deal. The problem is timing. The show is set in the 1870s and 1880s, but the real Colonel Sanders wasn't even born until 1890, and Kentucky Fried Chicken as a company didn't exist until the 1950s. It's a fun cameo, but historically, it makes absolutely no sense. Stunt work provided another memorable slip. In a Season 5 episode called The Odyssey, a tense scene shows a character being thrown from a moving train. If you watch closely, what actually gets thrown is clearly a dummy, landing stiffly in the grass, while the real stuntman performs a separate, far more graceful rolling fall down the hill nearby. Side by side, the difference between the limp prop and the athletic stunt performer is almost comedic. Set design had its own recurring slip-ups. In at least 2 episodes, eagle-eyed viewers have noticed tree branches visibly moving and rustling outside an upstairs window, even though no such tree actually exists near the house in any other scene. It's likely leftover stock footage or a sound effect used to add atmosphere, but it doesn't quite match the rest of the environment. Similarly, a particular quilt seems to defy the laws of physics, appearing on completely different beds belonging to different families throughout the series, a small but telling sign that props were being reused across sets more than continuity supervisors probably would have liked. Costuming slipped up here and there too. Despite being set in the 1870s and 1880s, some characters can be spotted wearing clothing or hairstyles that clearly belong to a different era, including a bra that wouldn't be invented for decades and perm styles far more reminiscent of the 1970s than the pioneer period. Melissa Gilbert has openly acknowledged that her hair was often too long and too modern-looking for the character she was playing, which is a pretty candid admission for an actor to make about her own historical drama. One of the more charming continuity mysteries involves the character Albert. Different parts of the show's extended storyline seem to disagree about whether Albert survived into adulthood to become the town doctor or met an earlier fate. Fans have debated the discrepancy for years, and in one particularly delightful moment, Melissa Gilbert addressed the confusion directly in a personalized video message, joking that Albert did, in fact, meet his end, but returned to Walnut Grove afterward as a friendly neighborhood zombie doctor. It's obviously not meant to be taken seriously, but it's a fun example of how even the actors are in on the show's inconsistencies. And finally, there's the finale itself. The series closer, The Last Farewell, is set in 1901, more than a decade after most of the earlier seasons take place. Logically, that means most of the adult characters should have aged into their 60s and 70s, and the children from later seasons should have grown into young adults. Instead, everyone looks essentially the same as they did years earlier in the show's internal timeline, as though time simply stopped moving for Walnut Grove while the rest of the world kept going. So what happened to the people behind all of this? Michael Landon remains the standout financial success story from the cast, having built substantial wealth by the time of his death in 1991, and he made sure to leave a significant inheritance to each of his 9 children. Karen Grassel, who played Caroline Ingalls, continued working in film and television after the show ended, while Melissa Gilbert's career took her through more ups and downs, including her unexpected run for Congress in 2016. The Greenbush sisters, who played the youngest Ingalls children, have also gone on to build lives well outside the spotlight. It's worth pausing on just how strange that contrast is when you think about it. Here was a show that millions of fans